I'm Motoe Sasaki, Professor of American History and Gender at Hosei University in Tokyo. Today, I'm going to present a paper entitled Creating a Cooperative Community Through Prayer and Activism, Ellen Gates Starr, Vida D. Scudder, Mary Kingsbury Simkhovitch, and Episcopal Lay Women's Order. This paper is a part of my larger research project, reconsidering progressivism in the US from the perspective of religious faith. For this purpose, I pay special attention to Anglo-Catholicism, a theological movement in the Anglican and Episcopal Church, which emerged on both sides of the Atlantic during the late 19th century and the early 20th century as a response to the growing influence of evangelical liberal Protestantism. By exploring the activism of those inspired by the ideas of Anglo-Catholicism in northern US cities, I will show that their activism was, in part, an attempt to resist the encroachment of social control in their daily lives as Weberian notions of rationalization, bureaucratization, and alienation were being felt by many, especially middle to upper class urbanites. By exploring Anglo-Catholic influenced activism, I will revisit progressivism from a standpoint of individual subjectivity and agency, while tracing their moment of back and forth between the public, private, and intimate spheres. In so doing, moreover, I will try to show different historical currents of socialism and communitarianism in the US. In this presentation, I will take up the activism promoted by Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch, all of whom were notable leaders of the US settlement movement. Starr was co-founder of Full House in Chicago with Jane Addams. Scudder established the college settlement in New York and also made a commitment to Denison House in Boston. And Simkhovitch founded Greenwich House in New York. By exploring their settlement activism, I will show the ways that their religious faith, in their cases Anglo-Catholic ideals, informed and shaped their visions of a new society, and how such visions were connected to their gender perspective. Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch were all descended from old New England families of Puritan origin, but switched their religious affiliation from the Unitarian and the Congregational Church to the Episcopal faith in their teens and early 20s. They were in search of spiritual regeneration in order to overcome existential angst, and fell into the category of what Jackson Lear's terms anti-modernist, who, in the face of ever-increasing phenomena of modernity, including secularization, confronted a strong sense of the emptiness of life, or weightlessness in the Nietzschean sense. One potential and quintessentially American way to replenish spiritual strength was to have the experience of being reborn. At that time, the Episcopal Church became popular by virtue of its stance of a via media between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism based on Christian faith in Anglicanism. Those who sought individual and societal wholeness through a supernatural element, which was, in Lear's words, quote, unavailable in the decorated humanitarianism of liberal Protestantism, unquote, turned to the Episcopal Church. For converts such as Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch, moreover, Anglo-Catholicism in the Episcopal Church, which emphasized tradition, dogma, and visible beauty in worship, and pre-modern alternatives to liberal theology, was particularly attractive. Also, Anglo-Catholicism originated from the Oxford movement with high church circles of the Anglican Church in England in the mid-19th century. Anglo-Catholicism placed importance on Catholic elements in worship and theology rather than the Protestant heritage of the Anglican Communion. As part of the reaction to the rise of evangelical liberal Protestantism, it regarded the Reformation as a detrimental historical turning point that not only demolished Catholic churches and monasteries, but also abolished communal land ownership, associations, and solidarity, leading to the advent of laissez-faire capitalism and liberal utilitarian individualism. Based on a revised view of the historical understanding of Protestantism, moreover, Anglo-Catholics began to engage in a variety of activism to restore the organic community and communal living as in pre-Reformation days. As a result, the devotees of Anglo-Catholicism actively took part in social movements challenging the ills, injustices, and inequalities generated by what they saw as the ruthless and immoral capitalist economy of the day. One such social movement was the settlement house movement, which began with the establishment of Toynbee Hall in the East End of London in 1884 by the Anglican clergyman and Oxford University students. As historian Daniel Rogers points out in his Atlantic Crossings, it was, quote, a magnet for American visitors, unquote, including notable US settlement movement leaders. In contrast to the English model, however, the US settlement movement, in Rogers' words, quote, was much more quickly and deeply feminized through a women's college network that was unknown in England, unquote. As scholarship on the US settlement movement has shown, settlement workers are honestly dedicated to the improvement of the health, education, employment, living conditions, and welfare of immigrant families and neighborhoods. As shown in the case of Jane Addams, probably the most renowned settlement worker, and her like-minded allies. Settlement workers played a significant role in introducing legislation to protect the safety and lives of immigrant workers and their families. In order to develop activism in an effective and efficient manner, they diligently incorporated knowledge of social sciences, in particular sociology, into their activities, and participated actively in social survey programs in cooperation with social scientists. By comparison, Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch were less enthusiastic than Addams and her like-minded people about forming an affiliation with either administrative bodies or social scientists. One reason behind this was the ideals of their activism, grounded in their religious beliefs. As for the relationship between religion and the settlement movement, gender historians like Mina Carson and Eleanor Stebner have emphasized the influence of liberal Protestantism on settlement workers like Jane Addams, characterizing their activism as a practice based on the humanitarian religion. One could argue that the influence of liberal Protestantism, which had an ideological affinity for modern progress, brought them closer to the modern functional tools such as state apparatus and scientific knowledge. Meanwhile, Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovich's Anglo-Catholic faith brought them to considerably different stance toward the settlement work from their counterparts. First and foremost, for Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch, the goal of their activism was to create an organic community based on the spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood, in which all kinds of people work and live together. For this purpose, the Holy Ghost appeared in their eyes more helpful and operative than the modern tools on which their peers like Addams placed high expectations. The difference in means, though it appears of less consequence, was a manifestation of their creed and practice. As noted above, all of them converted from liberal Protestantism to Anglo-Catholicism in youth, which facilitated to shape the characteristics of their settlement activism. Ellen Kate Starr came from a Unitarian family in Illinois. She recalled that, quote, as a young girl, the very Protestant and evangelical form of religion, which was first urged upon me at school, never really engaged my interest or attention, unquote. In her early 20s, she began to, quote, discover in myself some rudiments of spiritual craving, unquote. And a few years later, Starr was confirmed in the Episcopal Church in Chicago. Around the time when Starr started to take a real interest in Anglo-Catholicism under the influence of Father James Otis Huntington, the founder of the Anglican Order of the Holy Cross, she had an opportunity to visit the newly established Toynbee Hall with Jane Addams, a friend from her days at Rockford Female Seminary. At Toynbee Hall, Starr felt a sense of exaltation, witnessing the ideas of the settlement house advocated by John Ruskin, an English art critic who founded the Guild of St. George with the aim of restoring pre-industrial medieval values and community. A year after their visit to Toynbee Hall, Starr and Addams found Hull House in Chicago in 1889. For Starr, the strength of the settlement movement was, quote, a very real impulse to eliminate the unreal and artificial barriers of class and station, unquote. And its objective was, quote, to seek to work together for mutual good as one community on the basis that the real good for the individual and of society must be at one, unquote. To achieve the goal, she observes, quote, the current settlement is unquestionably in the absence of the religious atmosphere, unquote. What she meant by religious atmosphere was, quote, the spirit of faith with which the friendships might bear rich fruit and the strong and genuine social life of the settlement might be wholly pervaded, unquote. The problem Starr found in the settlement movement was the increasing tendency of utilizing the scientific method, or in her own words, quote, the tendency toward a mechanical institutionalism, bringing the settlement movement into a cult instead of promoting a simple living of life, unquote. Starr's stance, which eventually estranged her from Adams, was shared by Vida D. Scudder, a daughter of a Congregationist missionary to India, who was, after her father's death, raised in Massachusetts. Scudder converted to the Episcopal faith in her teens with her mother and aunt. After she graduated from Smith College, she had an opportunity to study at Oxford University, where she came under, quote, Ruskinian influence that had insensibly permeated the university, unquote, at that time. Before she returned to the US, Scudder spent time at Toynbee Hall and founded the college settlement in New York in 1889, the same year as Hull House. In her article, College Settlement, and entitled College Settlement and Religion, Scudder stated that the settlement movement is not missionary, but it is religious, although it seems to create many people purely secular, unquote. She continued to claim that, quote, many of those interested in the settlement movement believe it to be religious, profoundly, permanently, and definitely religious, because its inspiration is found in the impulse toward practical brotherhood, unquote. The practical brotherhood was, moreover, exemplified in the way that, quote, Jews, Roman Catholics, agnostics, Anglicans, and Protestants of all descriptions have united in the settlement life, unquote. According to Scudder, a key to creating practical brotherhood was cooperation among a variety of groups of people from diverse backgrounds, which was promoted effectively with the aid of the gift of tongues. In her words, quote, the ability to make oneself understood, not by forcing or even urging other people to learn our language, but by talking to them in their own, unquote. The same position was shared by Mary Kingsbury Simkhovitch. She came from a Congregationist family in a town near Boston. In her late teens, she was confirmed in the Episcopal Church in Boston. When she was a student at Boston University, she attended St. Augustine's, an African-American congregation under the direction of Father Field, an English priest of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, an Anglican religious order. After studying in Berlin, she moved to New York. and founded Greenwich House in 1902 with the objective of, quote, the building of a neighborhood based on the twofold picture of unity and diversity, unquote. Simkhovitch defined it, a settlement, as, quote, a microcosm of our American life made up of the neighborhoods that are heterogeneous in character, composed of the people of every racial origin or different creeds, and of widely different occupations, unquote. From such a standpoint, she claimed that, quote, the settlement must be nucleus of local democratic action in order to fulfill the promise of American democracy, which must arrive at unity of action through diversity, unquote. Simkhovich's deep conviction for common good-based neighborhood communitarianism, moreover, led her to the view that, quote, governments must always be under suspicion, no matter how wonderful they look, so long as they assume the power that belongs only to the people, unquote. She went on to say that, quote, force will never be the means of bringing about unity, unquote. Her viewpoint of unity and diversity was grounded on her faith in the Catholic interpretation of the Anglican Communion. According to Simkhovitch, quote, the true nature of Catholicity appears not primarily in organization, though that is a necessary factor, but rather within the body of the faithful, unquote. Based on the understanding of Anglo-Catholic faith, Simkhovitch put her faith into the practice of her settlement activity. An essential underpinning of their faith and activism for Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch was the Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross, SCHC. The SCHC was established in 1884 by Emily Morgan, a devoted Episcopal woman from Connecticut and pioneer in social work among female workers. She described the SCHC as, quote, an order of women living in the world with a desire for the stronger development of the spiritual life in ourselves and others, unquote. Although the SCHC was an outgrowth of the movement to restore convents within the Anglo-Catholic movement, it was not an order per se. Companions did not either take vows or live together in convents. Instead, they were to follow a daily schedule set out in a document called the intercession paper, which was mailed monthly to each companion, praying on common things and sending and receiving prayers to and from one another. In addition to daily prayer, companions attended a 2-week retreat every summer at a facility called Adrian in Massachusetts, which was donated by Morgan. Morgan wrote in her letter to companions that, quote, the greatest features of annual conferences have been the strong, even spiritual friendships which have grown out of our association together, unquote. As her note subtly suggests, finding a long-term partnership in summer retreats was a rather common thing, and the SCHC affirmed such intimate relationships. Along with building genuine camaraderie among companions, including forming an intimate partnership, moreover, summer retreats were an important occasion for the SCHC to raise awareness and share knowledge among companions about social issues of the day. For instance, the conference held during the retreat in 1909 addressed the church and social justice, and participants vigorously exchanged views and opinions on the issues of poverty, labor, and the church responsibility for creating a just society. As Morgan clearly states, the mission of the SCHC is, quote, to meet the serious religious, educational, and social problems of our age, first by prayer and then by battle, unquote. By following the cue of Morgan, companions share the faith and put it into practice to challenge the injustice generated by ruthless competitive capitalism, a byproduct of liberal utilitarian individualism. Naturally, some companions came to embrace a socialist hope for a cooperative society. Among them were Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch. They saw their embracing of social ideas as simply an extension of their religious faith, and Starr stated that, quote, "I became a socialist because I was a Christian," unquote. She explained her stance by noting that, quote, "the Christian religion teaches that none should wish to profit by the loss or disadvantage of others," unquote. And socialism was a collective means to change, quote, "our whole unchristian system of life," unquote. In a similar vein, Scudder declared that, quote, "the ultimate source of my socialist convictions was and is Christianity, and unless I were a socialist, I could not honestly be a Christian," unquote. In her case, moreover, she attempted to reconfigure the relationship between materialism and religion. According to Scudder, quote, "the doctrine of economic determinism or the materialistic interpretation of history was extraordinarily consonant with a sacramental understanding of the universe," unquote. She even had a desire to show that in the, quote, society of Marxian hope, Catholic doctrine would find itself at home," unquote. Unlike Scudder, both Starr and Simkhovitch had some reservations about materialism. Starr stated that although there was a wide skepticism among Christians, that, quote, "many socialists were materialists. Socialism does not make a materialist of me, nor does even the capitalistic system," unquote. Simkhovitch stated that she had a deeper affinity to the guild socialists, who looked back on the guilds of the Middle Ages and advocated the decentralized communitarian model of socialism than the materialist Marxist. Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch took different stances regarding materialism, yet their differences largely came from the different degrees of emphasis that each placed on the principle of sacramentality in Catholic theology, rather than the ideological fault lines between reformist and leftist, or idealist and realist. The basis of their activism lay to a considerable degree in their spiritual perspective. Their activism was, moreover, closely connected to their gender perspective. Scudder maintained that, quote, "women are adapted to play a leading part in the transference of society from a competitive to a cooperative basis, because they would rather have 10 people to love and cherish them than $10,000 any day," unquote. Although Scudder's categorization of women had a resonance of an essentialized femininity of Victorian era, for her family meant, quote, "a highly organized group of non-competitive activities in purest communal passion," unquote. Scudder's communal notion of family was also shared by Starr and Simkhovitch as a basis for a cooperative society or an unity of brotherhood and sisterhood being formed with the aid of the Holy Ghost. For them, the communal notion of family was also a critique against the increasing penetration of heteronormative discourse and standards. At the time, Catholicism attracted on the both sides of the Atlantic those who felt at odds with the middle-class family values, which were promoted through various reform movements pushed forward by evangelical Protestants and progressive reformers who often overlapped with each other while transforming the intimate sphere into their reform fields. In this presentation, by taking up Starr, Scudder, and Simkhovitch settlement activities, I have tried to illuminate the ways that their Anglo-Catholic faith shaped the characteristics of their activism. The ultimate motive behind their activism was to protect the existential autonomy and integrity of ordinary people and communities. For this purpose, they tried to create a just society by idealizing an autonomous self-governing commune reminiscent of the medieval era. One could thus argue that their attempt was a backward-looking anachronistic venture. Yet, their activism was part of a reaction to the modern and secular norms, standards, and regulations rapidly encroaching into every part of their daily life through a variety of progressive reform activism. Thank you for listening. I would appreciate it if you could kindly send me any comments, suggestions, or corrections you may have to this email address.